Hey, everybody, it's Brett, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Behind the Stack, where today, in this nonfiction November, I will be sitting down with Ben Masters with his book, The Flitting, a memoir of fathers, sons, and butterflies. A little bit about Ben. He teaches English at the University of Nottingham. His literary journalism has appeared in the New York Times, the Times Literary Supplement, and Literary Review. So enjoy this episode, and thanks for being here. So, Ben Masters, I am so happy you're here today, coming to us from university. I really appreciate it. I thought your book was just, it was so beautiful. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And Ben makes a reference to Ted Baker shirts. So I broke out the Ted Baker shirts this morning just for him. And when you read the book, you will find out what that is. So I guess my first thing for you is I would love to know when you actually started the writing process. Was it before he passed or was it after? And how was that?
Yeah, it was. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. By the way, thank you very much for having me on your
No, sure.
podcast. It was after, so I had no conception of the book at all during the. So the book takes place roughly sort of the last 6 months of my dad's life. There's a few bits that sort of go out of that chronology, but and I had no conception of the book during that period at all. And it wasn't until after my father passed away, I started writing a eulogy for his funeral. And I had this idea that I was going to write about butterflies because butterflies are the sort of the central theme of the book and one of his passions. And so the book is all about me becoming my dad's connection to the outside world when he was too ill to do it, and sort of going out and searching for butterflies to sort of report back to him, and not knowing what I was really doing at all at first. And so I started writing this eulogy about that, and it just got longer and longer and longer until I realized this is like far too long for a eulogy, and I sort of put it to the side. But at that point, I realized that there was something there that I wanted to write about and to think more about. There was also these strange things happened during that sort of those last 6 months of my dad's life, where in retrospect, when I started thinking about them, they seemed like oddly literary phenomena. These strange little sort of experiential rhymes. So for instance, I was in my parents' garage doing some jobs for my mum, and dad was in the hospice, and I found the wing of a small tortoiseshell, butterfly wing, and then like an hour later or 2 hours later, we got a phone call from the hospice saying it's time to come in. Your dad's he's only got a couple of hours left. And also there was a butterfly called the clouded yellow, which I'd spent a lot of the summer sort of searching for and hadn't managed to see. And it was the last one that my dad and I sort of properly spoke about. And he said, sort of, don't give up. And then the day after he passed away, I went outside to get some fresh air, went for a run, and I saw one. It was the first one I'd ever seen. And it was little things like that. When I looked back, I sort of thought these feel almost poetic in some way. And again, I wanted to sort of explore them. So after dad had passed away, I mean, I can't remember exactly. I think it was sort of maybe like half a year or something. I started trying to write some of this down and get some of it down. And it sort of, it progressed from there. But it quickly became something more than just an account of what had happened in those final months. That's when lots of other stuff started to come in, and it just got sort of bigger and bigger and bigger.
Did you find it cathartic after the fact?
I think I must have done. I've been asked similar things about this, like, is it therapeutic to write? And I guess it was, but I don't know if I was really thinking that at the time of writing it. I'm sure it's played a sort of monumental role in how I've processed my dad's death. And I think the thing that I really valued about writing it was it felt like a continuation of a conversation that otherwise kind of wouldn't have happened. So I felt that, and some of the book is written as if it's sort of a dialogue between dad and I, things that I wish I'd sort of shared or talked about, particularly the kind of the bits in the book where I'm talking about like the artists and the writers and the musicians that I love and what they mean to me, and trying to articulate that to dad in ways that I never did or would have done when he was here. So I think that was probably helpful. Another thing that I've often found when I sort of talk about writing the book, and it sounds kind of strange, and I felt guilty saying it at first, is that it was a real pleasure to write the book. Like, it was quite a joyful book to write in many ways. Obviously, there's bits in it that are immensely difficult to write and to read and to think about, but I think it's just the subject matters. It's butterflies, writing about our passions, our relationship. My relationship with my dad was not I think it's quite easy when you sort of describe this book to almost for someone to mistakenly think that, oh, maybe it's a book about a sort of a distant father and son who come together at the last
Sure.
moment over butterflies, and that's not the case. And I hope the book, when people read it, they'll know that that's not the case. We were very close, but there were these sort of core parts of our ways of seeing the world and these things that made up our sort of personal sensibilities. So for Dad, the natural world, which I just didn't share and didn't really have much of an interest in beyond sort of what anyone has a kind of interest in the natural world. And then my love of sort of literature and music and films and all these kinds of things. We never managed to share those things in a satisfactory way. If anything, I completely resisted my dad's interest until those sort of final months. I didn't want to hear
Yeah.
about his love of the natural world. And so to be able to write the book and bring those things together, there was a real bittersweet element to it, but there was also a great joy to it to elements of it in some ways. So maybe it was cathartic. I honestly don't know, but I'm sure I did a lot of sort of making sense of things through the writing of the book. Because that's for me part of what writing is. It's kind of making sense of things through the act of writing, which is its own kind of peculiar thinking.
Sure. It's also really digging in and getting to know your father in these final moments as the person that he was and his interest. And I don't know that a lot of people do that with their parents. You know, we view our parents as our parent, and I don't think it's until later in life that you start to see your parents for the individuals that they really are, and
Mm.
their shortcomings and their strengths and their own fears, insecurities, all those things. And that, honestly, they're just human and they're just like anybody else. And I think it also gets magnified when you become a parent yourself. And I think even the way we tend to parent and the way we look at our children, I know I found, especially when my kids were young, wow, okay, so this is what it's like. And this is, in relation to how my parents brought us up.
Mm.
So I thought about that a lot when I was reading your book.
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
Um,
one of the things that this period in time coincides with is the birth of my first son. So he was 1 during the period that the book describes, and I think that's right. He was just about to turn 2 when Dad passed away. And I think that was part of it. Like, I noticed that a lot of the things I used to take for granted in my dad, things that he sort of knew so particularly through the natural world, things that used to kind of irritate me when I was a like moody teenager, a moody child, like his ability to name the trees and to point, he'd always be pointing at things. And I find that when you're a child, like if a parent points at something, you want to look at anything but the specific thing that they're pointing at. He wasn't like
that happens with the
didactic or
whole
anything like
thing.
that. He
That
wasn't.
won't that won't end, Ben.
Yeah,
That'll just
no,
get
no,
worse as
I'm
they get
sure it won't.
older.
But like, so, some of the things that I sort of took for granted in him, I always had this sense that like Dad had the natural world taken care of for me and my brother, so we didn't have to like
Hmm.
think about like naming the birds and the butterflies. And I suddenly had
Right.
this like intimation that my son's gonna say, in the way that really young children do, they are interested in those things. When you're really young, I think you're just you're naturally curious. And I sort of had this sense that like I won't be able to answer if he says to me, "What's the difference between a swift and a swallow?" or "What tree is that?" I won't know. And it suddenly seemed to be important in some way. And then I started interrogating myself about that. Like, why is it important? Why do I need to know everything? And so there was this strange thing about trying to inhabit like Dad's perspective so that I would be able to deliver on some of the things that he was at least trying to deliver on for me. And I'm sure that was part of it. I mean, that was kind of, it was at the very back of my mind, but I'm sure that the fact that I sort of fairly recently become a father while he was, going through the final phases of his life it was a kind of profound convergence of things for me. I mean, it's also the lockdown as well. It's the pandemic. It was COVID. It was
Sure.
2020, and so that made it very strange. And we had all sorts of rules. I'm sure it's similar over in the States, but we had all sorts of rules about not being able to, well, not really meant to leave the house other than for exercise, let alone see family. So my son wasn't able to see my dad, and vice versa, and other than under very limited circumstances. And Dad was sort of doubly imprisoned because he was too poorly to leave the house, but also you kind of weren't allowed to leave the house at certain periods of
Sure.
time. So there's all of these sorts of things were going on, and it all. I mean, back to your original question, it all goes into this thing of realizing the vulnerability of your parents. It was all magnified by that kind of strange period in time that it was.
Yeah. No, my mom she was in a retirement community, but she'd started to get dementia, and it started falling. They put her in the medical center, part of the retirement community, and this lockdown happened, and she was isolated completely, which was, of course, the worst thing for someone who is having any kind of mental issues. And so it was like going off a cliff. It dropped precipitously. And it was the same thing. She passed not too long after. I remember it was the election week in America when Biden was elected, and so I couldn't go home for the funeral. Similar to your brother, I had to say goodbye to her over the phone, and at that point, she was far enough progressed that I don't know that she was completely cognizant of what was happening or what was being expressed, but it was all such a surreal moment. A lot of that came up for me with this as well,
Mm.
because of just that experience, and so many people went through similar things, so it's crazy. You describe your dad being like the paragon of masculinity, and that both your parents kind of conform to what would be typical gender roles your whole life, and then you talk in part about kind of the evolution of style. Can you talk a little bit about that? It becomes a question that comes up a lot in the book in terms of what is it to be a man and what is it to be a father, and how has that changed for you now that you have kids, and in terms of your own sensibilities.
Sure. Well, I mean, what I describe him as is like not so much the paragon of masculinity, but what I thought was the paragon of masculinity. So
Sure.
growing up, like most kids, I guess, you kind of look at your parents, and other than what I don't know. For me, that was most of my sense of like what those particular roles were: a mum and a dad, and a man and a woman, and so on. And like that's something I sort of
Yeah.
reflect on in the book. Is like that sense of it's another thing as you sort of come of age, you kind of realize the limitations of that, and so. In some ways, this is one of the challenging things you're doing when you're doing some kind of life writing. I was trying to inhabit my dad's perspective, and I think Dad did have quite like
Mm.
a black and white sense of this is what a man is. This is masculinity, and this is a man's role, and a lot of it was the kind of stuff that you see reflected back at you in the media, and it's kind of like the dominant narrative. It's the hegemony, or whatever you want to
Sure.
call it. That's kind of what it is. So you see it confirmed everywhere you look, and I think these are the kinds of things I was uh, like really cognizant of as a new parent, as a father, and sort of thinking about, well, how do I want those things to be slightly different? I mean, one reviewer described the book as a sort of a millennial perspective in sort of friction with a sort of a boomer's
Mm.
perspective of the world, and I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, but I'm sure there's a grain of truth to that. I mean, one of the things I do in the book is I try and in some of those sort of conversations, imaginary conversations after he's gone, introduce him to some of the writers who I love, who are questioning these kinds of things. So Angela Carter is an example of a writer who's just meant a lot to me, and I just know my dad wouldn't have got on with in terms of the reading experience of reading Carter. My dad wasn't a particularly literary man for a start, so I think he would have just thought it was all a bit pretentious or something. Virginia Woolf as well is another important person who I write about in these sort of terms. Another part of it was also sort of watching my mum go through those final months, and the kind of how untethered she felt and how scared she was for a variety of reasons, but partly because she was losing the man who had kind of taken care of a lot of things that she saw as being the things that a man takes care of. And I try not to be particularly judgmental about these things in the book. I try and keep as neutral as sort of possible, but what I do is sort of try and interpret the effects of those things on the dynamic of the family environment and the house. And I'm not saying it's all bad, but I'm sort of fascinated by, I mean, also my dad's relationship with his dad, which was a lot more problematic than my
Mm.
relationship with my dad. And I write about my grandfather, which is one of the most challenging parts of the book to write. And I'm sure my dad had this sense of feeling the need to come up to a certain kind of mark or sense of what a man was based on his father. And I don't think these things are in any way sort of exceptional. I think everyone experiences these at some, as they're growing up, that sense of there's some kind of mold or something that's set, and if you're not meeting it, then this becomes like anxiety inducing. But as you get older, hopefully you learn to let go of sort of some of these things. So I was reflecting on all these things, and obviously like it's all bound up with the sense of Dad's own feelings during that time, that he was no longer the person that he was. So there's a bit in the book where I describe bathing him towards the end of the very end. He was too unwell to do it, and he was at home, and I sort of said, well, I'll do it. And I just always remember him sort of saying to me, It just sort of almost whispered to me, I'm not the man I used to be. Just as I was
Yeah.
about, I think basically it was about the moment I was about to pull the sheet back and see him completely, uh, and it just really struck me that that was on that, even at that stage when he was so ill and so sort of helpless, that there was still that sense of like a kind of pride that he needed me to know that that somehow this isn't who he was. I mean, it really sort of choked me up, but it was those kinds of things I was sort of trying to reflect on in the book, and it was sort of a challenging thing to do. And like I said, I try not to be sort of didactic about like my views on sort of gender roles and my family life and my home life and stuff. Like I didn't want to write that sort of book that was trying to do down like his views and his
No, and it
generation
doesn't feel
and
like
so
that.
on.
It doesn't.
That was what was one of the challenges of the book, actually, was trying to write it in a way that was sort of emotionally true without necessarily having to sort of have something to preach or something,
But it doesn't come off that way at all. It just, that all really resonated with me. You talked a moment about Angela Carter and Virginia Woolf, and Nabokov plays a big part in this as well, connecting your love of literature with his love of butterflies. Now, was this a happy accident that you started to find all of these references? Because there's, two butterflies within these works, and then you're like, oh my God, this is crazy. Or how did that come out?
some of them I was Nabokov, for instance, like you can't miss the butterflies in Nabokov, and I was always sort of thought, well, there's a happy convergence there. But no, a lot of them I went searching for. So in the same way that when Dad was alive, I was out in the woods and the meadows and searching for butterflies. One of the things that I did when I was writing the book was I went searching for them in my natural history, which is in the books. And so that sort of preoccupied me for a while, was like revisiting authors that have been formative for me, looking for butterflies. I mean, some of them, like I had a sense of it, So it suddenly dawned on me that in Angela Carter's last book, Wise Children, one of the main characters becomes a lepidopterist. But I'd never really thought about it before. So it was like, I knew that was there, and then I went back to it to think, okay, well, what does that mean? And like, what are the butterflies doing in this book and in other books? So there was a sense of sort of like hunting for them. And some of it became, I mean, like there's a bit about The Sopranos, and I suddenly remembered there's an episode of The Sopranos when it's one of the dream sequences, and there's a caterpillar on the back of Ralph Cifaretto's head in this dream. He's driving the car, and then we cut back to it, and it's pupated, and it's become a butterfly, and things like that. Especially when going back to this question of sort of thinking about masculinity, you'd have moments like that where you think sort of, eureka, here's this show that I used to watch with my dad, and it's in some ways all about masculinity, and then here's this butterfly, and what's that do? And these were the kinds of connections that were getting me sort of really excited when I was writing the book, as a way of bringing together the things that shaped Dad, the things that have shaped me, and the butterflies was sort of the connector, the great connector that brought all of these things together. But when you start looking, they're everywhere. But suddenly, he'd opened my eyes. Butterflies were everywhere, not just out and about, but in the books that I was reading and in the things that I was watching, and even the music I was listening to. They're everywhere.
Yeah, it's like that thing where you say, well, I've never seen a Subaru, and someone says, this is a Subaru, and then you see them everywhere. There was a line that you say in the book that it really stuck out to me, and it's in reference to, I think, your dad trying to get you involved, but you say you can't reverse a lifetime of indifference. And that resonated with me when I was thinking about that, because I thought you have this moment of, and again, maybe it's because I'm a father, that I viewed it through this lens of your dad wanting to make this connection with you, and kind of the rebuff. And I don't know, I have that now. For example, I love to read, obviously, and my son likes to read. My daughter, I cannot get her to read, and it kills my soul. But you try to find this way to connect in.
Well, it's a central part of the book in some ways. How do you explain the things that matter to you? Like, how do you do that? And
Yeah.
that applies to like really sort of like deep philosophical sort of questions, but it also applies to the music that you like and the books that you like and what you like to do with your spare time. And I think this is really, really common. I think we can go over one of two ways, or indifference, but I think most people grow up kind of in some ways resisting the things that their parents are into. And my dad shared most of his interests with his dad, and then with me, it was more, we shared lots of interests, like sports and things like that. We'd watch that together and watch the rugby together or whatever, go to the games. But there was these things that were like really fundamental to who we are, and that we were unable to share for all sorts of different reasons. And for quite different reasons, actually, because my dad really did try and want to share his love of the natural world, which wasn't like a hobby. That's just it's who he was. Grew up, he
Sure.
had a sort of rural working class upbringing. He was always out walking around and hiking and participating in country pursuits and stuff. That's what he did. And like every day he was walking the dogs, and that was a big part of his day, and seeing what he could see and following the natural cycles and measuring time in that sort of intuitive, natural way that he had with the seasons and all the various transformations that come with that. Whereas for me, it was much more, I almost didn't want to even try to share my interests until it was too late, because they seemed to evoke all sorts of tensions and conflicts in some way. I don't know. Like, as someone who first generation university goer in my family and stuff like that, and going and studying English and becoming a literary academic and writing books, like, to my dad, that was so alien. Not so much my mum, and I write about that in the book, about how mum did share some of these sort of passions with me in a sort of kind of indirect way. But I think dad was almost a little bit suspicious of these things. He was very proud of anything that my brother or I did, but when it came to books and reading, he just would sort of think that I was overthinking it and probably a bit pretentious.
You and your
And
you and your lofty ideas.
yeah, I mean, he was right. So I write in the book about how he's probably the only person to have ever read my PhD, which became a book, but he read it cover to cover, and like, it's I guess it is written for a specialist audience, and he asked me all these questions about it that I just couldn't, and they were really fair questions, but very fundamental questions, like, what do you mean by the ethics of literature, or something like that. And I just couldn't even begin to answer. And part of that was because of my sense of, like, how do I find the common ground to explain this? But really, it was a failing in me. I kind of like I have less so maybe now, but I certainly have always had this sort of feeling of anxiety and discomfort when it comes to trying to explain these things that preoccupy me in my mind, and I can sort of articulate them in my head and maybe on the page when I try and write them down. But when I try and explain them particularly to sort of loved ones who aren't perhaps tuned into books and the kinds of things I'm thinking about, very niche things, suddenly I just melt. And one thing that the book is doing is, in a sort of indirect way, trying to answer some of those questions that my dad was asking me years ago about my PhD, but answering them through sort of demonstration rather than explanation. So, it's by the end of the book, I sort of arrive at this conclusion that the butterflies have done that. It's by being able to share his way of reading the natural world with my way of reading books and films and music and so on. It's the butterflies that did it. They sort of, he taught me a new way of reading through that. But over the course of the book, I'm able to begin to explain some of those things that were always the kind of slight source of unease between us in some way. I mean, I also discovered that he was writing poetry himself, which becomes a big thing at the end of the book. That was quite a transformative moment as well.
I wanted to ask you about that, is when you discovered that and how that was for you. It's also, again, it goes back to the surprise of who our parents are, who they are as people, and that we just don't really know. So can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, he told me, this is when he was bedridden, and he sort of he had this little notebook by the side of his bed where he'd not written many poems. I think it was like 7 or 8 poems, very short poems in this notebook, and he gave it to me and basically just sort of said, "Do you want to look at them?" I think part of it was also he was thinking about his funeral, and there was a poem he'd written, and he was like, "Could you read this at my funeral, please?" And I was like completely stopped in my tracks, because it was this sense of, like with the butterflies, but now on my sort of side of the equation, it was like, why didn't I share this? Why didn't you share the poems with me? We could have talked about that. I've spent years teaching English and creative writing, and I say in the book, all the while, there was this person at home who I could have and should have been having these conversations with, and we could have been talking about this. And so he'd written these poems, and I write about them in the book, and they're beautiful. It always sounds harsh when I sort of say this, but like in the book, I'm very conscious of, Dad would want me to be honest with him. He wouldn't want me to be wishy-washy and sort of say, "I just love your poems, Dad." And like, they're not all great. They're just, from my subjective position, but I love them. They mean the world. They are my favorite poems in the whole world. But they're poems written by someone who has, in like really short period of time, has basically started reading lots of poetry and almost teaching himself by himself how to read that poetry and then how to write his own poetry. And there's a flair there. I mean, I clearly think he could have, gone on and written other stuff. But so in the book, I try and do a little bit of like, let's have that conversation and do a little bit of the literary analysis and think about it as like a thought experiment. And it's something I do when he's in the hospice, because I can't get hold of him because of the pandemic. We're not allowed to visit and all these kinds of things. So I start reading his poetry, and thinking about it. And like, his poems move me immensely. And there's one that was written, it's kind of inscribed for my grandchildren. And I reproduce that in its entirety. So it's short, but I reproduce it in the book, and I sort of say, "Here it is for you, your grandchildren, and they can read it whenever they want by their grandfather, the published poet." And I really got a kick out of that through this book. Dad is kind of now a published
They're
poet, and I
published.
felt like it was kind of a
Yes.
returning the gift of because what he'd given me with the butterflies and everything was like a complete, like almost a new worldview. Like, it was so profound and transformative for me. And I sort of thought, well, the least I can do is now say, you're a published poet now, Dad. And I love reading that poem at our readings and stuff. It's my favorite bit from the book to read. It's not they're not even my words; they're my dad's words. They're the best part of the book.
I love that. I was going to ask if you still, you kept up with this after this has all happened. Have you taken your son out?
Yeah, so yeah. Luckily, I mean, I have two sons now, so we've had a
Right.
second one after Dad passed away. So the eldest is just about to turn 6, and the youngest is not far off 3, and they are at the sort of age. I mean, my eldest, like, he is at that sort of age. I think it's like a golden window when they kind of do want, or my experience anyways, they do want to hear the things that you want to tell
Sure.
them.
Yeah.
And children do just have like a total affinity for the natural world, and can see the beauty and the wonder in it all. And I think aren't troubled by that sense of unknowing that almost sort of stopped me from ever getting started as an older person. So at the moment, like, they're both kind of interested to hear a little bit about butterflies, but I'm sure that will change. I mean, in the acknowledgements to the book, I say that. I mean, one thing I was conscious of is that, that they'll kind of know their granddad through the book, and that was another reason for sort of writing the book. Or they'll know my very sort of partial view of him. But I sort of end on the note of, but if history has anything to do with it, you probably won't want to read the book because you'll have no interest in any kind of literary pursuit, in the same way that I had no interest in any kind of like naturalist pursuit, because it's what your dad does. But at the moment, yeah, there's a picture that didn't make it into the book of me out during that time with my son when he was young enough to sort of go in a carrier on the front. And I'm sort of pointing at a butterfly, and my wife sort of got this picture of it. And I sort of say I do describe it in the book and say, I've got him pinned to my front, which is a length that even my dad never went to. Like, pinning you to your front so you can't possibly escape the pointing finger. I like to think that, I mean, it's one of those things that I'm sort of deeply obsessed with butterflies now, and like my summers are just like full of trying to find time and space to go and search for them. And I do have this sense of like, I find myself talking to my dad while I'm doing it, sometimes in my head, sometimes out loud, like it's just involuntary. And that's something he described to me that he did after his dad passed away. And there was a moment when he sort of said to me, look, I've always looked up almost, and Dad was a little bit more religious than I am, but I'd look up and speak to my dad and tell him what I'd seen, and did you just see that sort of thing? And he said to me, but now I'll be able to do that to you, because in those final months, that now that I was finally sort of showing an interest, he was sort of saying, I can now tell you what I've seen. And I remember thinking at the time, like, he's not gonna see, he basically can never leave the house, and I think he knew that, but he's not going to see these things to tell me. And I think he was kind of even subconsciously saying to me that I will be able to continue that conversation with him. And so that's something that happens quite a bit. I find, especially, and also when I'm sort of looking for something, having no luck, I find myself going, come on, Dad, help me out here. I need some help. I can't see this thing. It's that's continued.
I think that's really beautiful. I love that you have that. I'm so curious. He's just kind of remarked at in points in the book, obviously part of its proximity, but your brother, does he have an interest in any of this kind of stuff, or was he more of an academic, or how do you?
So I think my brother's position to Dad's interest is identical to mine. Like, we're just not interested. So Dad was failing on both fronts. Like, he was getting like double the frustration. He was like double the frustration and disappointment.
What am I doing wrong?
I describe it in my book. I say something like, he must have wondered what he'd done to deserve such indoor dwelling offspring, because like, it's worked outdoors. And my brother, similar to me, like all the pop culture interests, and he's my older brother, so I was often just following in his sort of trail, like the things that he was leading me to. He's a big video game fan, like that's like his absolute passion, is computer games, and to my dad, that's like, that's another planet. I mean, he's more likely to try and pick up a book and read some Nabokov than he is to sit down and play on the PlayStation or something. My dad.
Right.
So yeah, no. So it's kind of like it's a real, and my mum had no interest either in sort of dad's. It's kind of one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is because this is so central to who dad is, and everyone around him is just sort of like no thanks, and so it became his solitude and the thing that he and I, like some of that is by design. I think one of the pleasures of the natural world is being on your own. It's
Sure.
nice. It's nice to share it, but like when I go butterflying, I kind of want to be on my own. That's the kind of the part of the point. But he won't be the first or the last person, who has a passion that ultimately they don't really share with anyone. You
Yeah.
share it with friends. You're more likely to share it with friends, right, than you are with family, because the friends have you often your friends because you share interests. But anyway, yeah, he got it in those final months. I was giving it to him sort of twofold, like this, my interest and my just desperation to learn from him, and I wanted to know more. Like I had this sense of I need to sort of find this stuff, ask you this stuff now. Obviously, I was asking him stuff that was nothing, much more like much deeper stuff than about the natural world, about his life and his experiences and so on. But I did also just want to gather all this sort of local knowledge that he'd accrued over years and years of attentiveness and being in the moment and so on. And I was classic academic that I am. I was almost there with like pen and paper, being like, right, so where do I go for this? How do I
I
know
know. I
that that's
wondered if
that
you had like
one? And
dictaphone.
yeah, yeah. And in reality, I think in the book, I probably make more. Like, I think Dad told me less than he actually does in the book, because one of the challenges of writing the book is trying to remember exactly what he told me and when he told me, and one of my sort of ethics for doing any kind of sort of life writing is if you're going to not make something up, but if you're going to give them something to say that isn't quite like something they told you, it has to be something that makes them look good. It can't be something that makes them look bad. So a lot of the information that I learned about butterflies that I need to convey, sometimes I just give it to Dad in the book, in a way that he had a lot of other things on his mind at that time. It wasn't just like he was
Sure.
thinking about butterflies. And yeah, I mean that's a whole other aspect of the book, is like the question of like where does fiction and imagination come into it all? And I sort of reflect on that quite openly in the book about how you're making these scenes and in a quite novelistic way and making up dialogue, and it's the only way of doing it. The way I sort of square that is you're after a kind of a felt truth, an emotional truth, rather than a kind of documentarian kind of truth, which is just impossible when you're living something. It's not like you're making notes on it or something. I wasn't.
No, and it would be dry. I mean, what
Yeah,
what the book does is it and why the book resonates, I think, so deeply is because there is an emotional truth. Without knowing even how you got there. I mean, in terms of what you may have changed slightly, what you might have, if there was something embellished. There's almost a theatrical quality to it. The way that you end many sections, the way that you end many chapters, I think it's really effective. I want to be conscious of your time, but I want to talk really quickly about, I loved when you talk about music. I wanted to read something. I got to put my glasses on for this. You're talking about Luther Vandross, and you said it's the feel of Luther's voice that I carry with me rather than the details of individual songs. This applies to the books and writers I love too. It only takes a day for me to completely forget the specifics of a book, the plot, the characters, even their names. What stays with me instead is a unique feeling of being with. And then you say it's difficult to describe, but I'm sure readers have experienced it, that particular intimacy, which we might call voice. I love this so much. And first of all, I have to say, yesterday, as I was finishing this, as I was sitting at the car wash, I got into my car after, and I put on Dance with My Father, uh, which you talk about, and I lost it in the car. Like, I was sitting there and I had tears streaming down my face. And like, I've listened to that song so much because I was such a Luther Vandross at the time fan. And that quote, it's so resonating to me. And it's so right about books, and it's so right about authors. I talk about this a lot, where books for me, exactly like you said, I can get through something and 6 months later, I can't give you specifics of the plot. I remember some characters, but it's the feeling that's evoked while I'm reading the book. It's the connection that I'm feeling with the author who's conveying these things that I think is so incredibly resonant. I think you nailed it on the head.
Thank you. Yeah, it was that chapter. It's a chapter called Voice, and it was originally right at the beginning of the book, and I ended up moving it right to the end of. It's one of those that's often the way, I think, like something that feels deeply important. You kind of like it needs to be in a position of prominence, but you don't quite. It can almost, you have to figure out
Mm.
where it belongs. And I was thinking about my dad's voice, and it's the moment when he's sort of in the hospice, and I can't get hold of him, and he's not answering his phone, and we're not allowed in, and I'm playing some old voicemails back, and so then I start reflecting on that, like this question of voice and the voice in his poems. I'm reading his poems at the time, and that idea of a conversation. All of these things sort of come together towards the end of the book, and I mean Luther goes back. He's there at the very beginning of the book because there's this moment
Yeah.
before my dad had the terminal diagnosis. So I haven't actually said at any point in the conversation, but he had cancer, and before he knew he had terminal cancer, but he knew he had cancer in his kidney, and he was going to go in for surgery to get the kidney removed. And the hope was that would resolve things. Obviously, he had a sense, well, it could be more than this. And I remember, I'm sort of sitting with him in the living room, and I was desperately trying to say to him, I wanted to tell him how I felt about him in like some kind of like clear way. He knew it, like our relationship wasn't one of those ones where there was any, like, he knew exactly how I felt, and I
Mm-hmm.
knew how he felt about me, but I just felt like I just need to tell him that I love him, and like that he's been a good dad and all that, just in case something happens in this surgery. I mean, I didn't think it would, but, and before I could sort of do it, he started telling me how he'd been listening to Luther dance with my father, and remembering how when his dad was in the hospice, and he was dying, dad sort of picked him up and started dancing with him, which was kind of funny to me, and and also really moving, because my granddad was just like, that would never have happened if he wasn't in a position of helplessness, because he was a
Yeah.
hard man, and that he wouldn't have, and it like completely threw me. I mean, I was trying to say this thing to him, and then he tells me that, and so I returned to Luther at the end, thinking about that, because Luther was like particularly my mum's favorite artist, really, but they both loved him, and I grew up, he was on in the house all the time, and I sort of love that, because I think it might be a surprise to the reader. Here's this man who, like, my dad is just so never really. He's left England a few times, but not really. He's not travelled, and he's not interested in any kind of particularly like American culture or anything. He's like so English rural sort of guy, but he just loves soul music and R&B music, and I write about that quite a bit in the book. And Luther was one of his, and it just seems like this kind of like odd combination, which I found like sort of fascinating, and thinking about that. Yeah,
He's
and
in
when I
his
think back to
wellies looking for butterflies with the power of love on his earbuds.
yeah, seriously. The Temptations were his favourite group, and like I say, Luther was more my mum's, but like he would listen to Luther. Dance with My Father actually is not my favourite Luther song at all. I'm not a massive fan of, like, it has huge meaning for me now, and I hear it and it wells me up because I think of Dad. But I always found it as one of his sort of just kind of like lachrymose and like a bit corny or something. But like
I don't disagree. Yeah, I don't disagree
yeah,
with you.
but like sort of the earlier sort of stuff, like sort of the '80s stuff, really, which I remember from childhood. As soon as I hear it, it's like it's the sound of home, which is really strange
Mm.
when you're from Middle England. Like, it's like that Luther Vandross is the sound, the sound of home in some ways. But it just is, and there's sort of like comfort in his voice. And I think that is true of the stuff you read, the writers that you, not comfort necessarily, but the writers that you love. It's like a social act when you read, in some ways, that sort of communion with the author.
Yes.
That goes so far beyond like what's the story about and what happens to the characters, and I genuinely do forget. I tend to forget all that stuff really, really quickly. I just have a bad memory, but it's the voice that stays with you, I think.
Yeah, I don't disagree. So the last thing I wanted to ask you is, you talk about in this, that in writing this and getting this out, you talked about the wellspring of feeling that your writing was lacking, that was now suddenly became available to you. Have you found now subsequently your writing has changed, or there is more of that availability to you now?
It's a good question. I've not done much, right. I am working on another book, which I'm sort of quite tight-lipped about, but it is another creative nonfiction. It's another kind of experiment with memoir, but I've been thinking about it and planning, and it's a book that involves a lot of research, so I've kind of been doing that, really. So
Mm.
I haven't done loads of writing since I finished writing this book. I think one of the things that I really grappled with in the book was this almost kind of sense of guilt that I was basically, my dad's death had given me this book. I don't know if that makes sense. I put it well, but suddenly I had something that felt really, really pressing to write about, and was just so emotionally provocative and meaningful. But it's all predicated on my dad dying, and I sort of say in the book, I'd
Yeah.
give up this book in a heartbeat to just have him here still. I also know that my dad would sort of say that I can hear his voice in my head saying, at least something bloody good's come of this. And that's what he would say. And obviously he is the implied reader. Like, he is the person that this book is for. And finally that sort of communion over books and through books, because of the butterflies and how that brings it all, would have brought him in. And that was the really bittersweet thing about writing the book or the most bittersweet thing was knowing that he wouldn't read it, when really he's the only person that he's the person I really, really need to read this book. But in terms of how that's affected my writing since, I don't know. But I did reflect on that a lot, how I'd spent basically sort of 10 years working on books and novels, most of which haven't gone anywhere. And I was sort of looking back and just thinking, this feels different. Writing, it's more that it felt different. To write this book, there was just an urgency, and it was just there at my fingertips because of the intimacy of it, I guess.
Yeah, and it's got to feel good also now. You've had it done. You've published something. You know what I mean? It says something about progress. It says something like it's done. So I would think that adds. You talked earlier about imposter syndrome. Well, you're a published author now, and so I don't know. I think that'll be interesting going forward.
I mean, I had already published. So I published a book. I published a novel. So my background was, so I'd written a novel, but that was 12 years ago, and I did think I was cooked, if I'm being honest. I was very young. I was very young when I published it, but I wasn't getting very far. And I've written about, by my estimation, about 4 novels in the interim period that obviously were not published. Most of them were never submitted. I only submitted one to a publisher, but it was a strange time, and I think Dad sort of died knowing that was in my sort of personal and professional life. My great frustration was this sense of, I'm not sure I'm ever going to get published again, and I would talk to him about that when we were having conversations about other things. And I do sometimes wonder if he sort of thought, he never said anything, but I wonder if he thought, well, one day you might write about this. I certainly hadn't thought it, so it never came up. I like to think that that he would have got a sort of a kick out of the fact that there was another book, and him and butterflies and the natural world and everything are kind of what made it happen.
I think he would have loved it. I'm sure he would have absolutely got a kick out of it. Well, Ben, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. I think it's just an incredible book. And for all of you watching or listening, you can go to my bookshop.org page. You can get the book there, or wherever you get your books. Buy independent if you can. But congratulations. It's really fantastic. And thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Brett.